with the Harvard.
Sorry.
Sorry, with so I previously served as an editor with the Harvard Business Review, which is where I met your professor. But I actually started my career in traditional book publishing, and from there pivoted to a focus on content marketing, which ultimately led me to journalism. So in college, I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. I went to college in DC. In college, I studied public relations and literature because I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I love to read. And the idea of studying books felt appealing. So I moved to New York City for the first time after I graduated, and applied for random jobs in industries that seemed neat. And one of those was an assistant editor role at Penguin Random House, working on manuscripts and with authors. And so I worked there for a bit, but New York City as a new graduate on a starting publishing salary is extremely tough. So I pivoted into marketing where there was more money and I hated it. But it helped me pay off my student loans. And then in 2019, I had moved to Boston by this point, and there was a job opening at HBR for an editor role. And I applied and ultimately found myself back in editorial, where I expect to stay. Um, I've only been with Forbes since November. And I will say that one of my favorite team members is a Morehouse grad, although he didn't study journalism. I believe he was policy, but you'll find that journalism has people from every major and walk of life within. It's sort of like law school in a way. Um, but anyway, Forbes has many sections on its website, and I primarily focus on the money section, which is any article written about markets, personal finance, wealth management, taxes, etc. And we have two distinct content models at Forbes. So we have our staff writers who are full-time Forbes employees and work your typical 9 to 5 day for Forbes. And they write breaking news stories and investigative pieces and profiles. And then we also have our contributors who are freelance experts who submit several stories a month on very specific topics that align with their expertise. So this will be your professors, researchers, consultants, thought leaders, executives, and anyone who has granular knowledge about a subject that our staff writers might not. So, for example, a staff writer might break the news on the Iran war, but a contributor who is also a market analyst by day might write about the financial implications of the conflict on the everyday consumer in terms of gas prices, energy costs, groceries, etc. So I edit both staff written and contributed content, and it's a long day with a lot of movement, but it's very interesting because every day is different. And I get to work with a lot of very cool people. Publishing as an industry is really shifting with AI, and that makes the job a lot less predictable than it used to be. But we're learning to work with it and evolve with the technology.
Very nice.
Um, so that's my background. Yeah, open to any and all questions.
So I'll start off with one other question is just help us understand. So I've been talking all semester about the difference between reporting.
Yeah.
There's a writing aspect, there's a reporting, the news gathering, and then there's the editing aspect. In
Yeah.
your point of view, how would you define editor?
Editor is about reaching people in the right way, reaching them where they're at and refining the content. So when you're gathering a story, you're doing, the who, what, when, where of it all. You are finding those little details and what makes this compelling news. When it comes to packaging it, that could be totally different than what the actual story might originally be. So say for example, you have different audiences that you're writing for. Different audiences respond to different structures, different tones of voice, different ways of accessibility. So say you're writing for a Forbes audience. Our Forbes audience is very broad and it's international. And so you have to take that into account when you're editing and saying, you know what, this localized term that may be common on the East Coast is not recognized on the West Coast. So we need to make sure people across all geographic areas know what we're talking about. Or, this, as the writer has submitted it, reads a little bit more technical than your average layperson might understand. So it's almost like translating it into something that everyone can read and understand. That involves, making sure that your lead and your nut graph are enticing and that you get sort of the meat and the crux of the story right at the end. A lot of writers will bury the lead where you're reading and you're reading and you're like, what is this really about? What is the question they're trying to answer? And why am I reading so much to uncover the answer? Editing is helping you put that right in the upfront so that your readers know what they're going to get as soon as they start reading a piece. There aren't any questions, there's no coyness, it's not clickbait, it's human. And in a world that's sort of driven by AI now, creating human sounding stories is more important than ever. And so, what an editor will do is work very closely with the writer to refine that voice and make sure the structure is readable for your average person.
Beautiful. I love that. And yeah, so many of the terms that we talked about in class, we talked about the lead and the nut graph
Yeah.
and the audience and
Mm-hmm.
catering and really informing that audience. So I see Tyler has a question. Feel free to ask.
Yeah, I know you mentioned earlier, I guess, you started off at the Penguin, correct?
Yeah, Penguin
Yeah,
Random
and then
House. So
you,
they
you were
merged.
saying, yeah, you were
Mhm.
saying, was that was a position that you said you didn't necessarily like the most, but it was helping you like throughout college, right? Or was that another job?
So I started off at Penguin Random House working on manuscripts and I loved it, but it was really hard to make ends meet as an intro editorial position in New York City where you're making 35K a year living in New York City.
Okay,
It's
yeah,
just
got it.
then what I ended up doing was pivoting into content marketing. And that is where, marketing PR, there's more money in the agency or in-house environments, and but you're writing or editing content that, at least for me, was not what I wanted to be doing. It was branded, all those articles that you see that
Mhm.
are like long and they're about something really niche like printer ink, and then at the very bottom it'll say sponsored by HP. I was editing that kind of stuff, and it was all kind of ads disguised as content. So it
Okay,
gave me the editorial experience and I worked with clients, but at the same time, it wasn't the same kind of like news driven pieces or narratives that I wanted to be working with. It was very ad specific. It
oh,
sounded like hidden ads. So I did that for a few years and I just didn't I did that and I paid off my student loans and I sort of got on my feet. And then I said, you know what? This isn't really what I want to be doing long term. So then
okay,
I
yeah.
tried
So I know,
another.
in terms of like the experience piece, of course, that's a big thing when you're starting out.
Yeah.
Like what was the biggest thing I guess that you took away, or like biggest skill that you took away in order for you to get into your next job? I would ask.
Communications and email etiquette were the most important things I learned because regardless of where you land, you're going to need to work with other people and you're going to need to email um, effectively and appropriately. When I worked at Penguin Random House and when I was working in a content marketing agency, you kind of have clients, whether they're your authors or they're your literal client accounts you're working on. And that helped me refine my professional voice and learn how to communicate with these stakeholders. Even now, as an editor at Forbes, my writers who I edit, I almost see as clients because we're working in partnership mode. We are working on the same end goal to get this piece out and to have it be as successful and well received as it can be. And that requires a lot of like relationship development and relationship management. And that's something that I learned from the get-go, and that can be transferable to every single job that you'll have moving forward is how do you have good working relationships? How do you make sure you're responding to emails in time and with the right information and the right tone and professionalism and communicating that two-way open communication? It was so valuable. And that's really what I carried forward the most when it came to all of my future endeavors.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Actually, my other class, if you all take it, we actually have a whole section on content mark. Some of it very well done. You can't even tell that
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
such a precise um, outcome that they're trying to get to. Darian, I see your hand up.
Yes. So how did you separate like when you hit on you doing content marketing and writing these articles that are ads that are selling something. How did you separate that from writing these from like doing these articles on, wealth management, talking to these investors and making sure
Yeah.
that you're not selling something in the article versus what you did previously?
Yeah, I mean it's a balance. I think, there are similarities and differences in both approaches. In both approaches, you're making sure the content is readable and scannable, and you're including subheads and bullets and takeaways and actionable calls to action. So there are similarities, I would say, in the structure of both. But obviously, when you're doing a news-focused piece, you're not going to be, embedding these product names. You might have expert sources offering quotes, but that's very different than saying also buy HP printer ink. It's really good stuff. So it was, I guess I was in a mode, I was in content marketing mode, but the more that I got acquainted, I mean, I went to Harvard Business Review and was working with authors who were very different backgrounds, a lot of academics, a lot of professors with very, very different experiences, and they would submit their articles that they would write on their own. And, my job was to go in and kind of help them refine it and make sure that it is accessible to someone who doesn't have that very niche expertise that they do. So there almost wasn't room to incorporate that kind of thing. It was more about a mindset shift of, okay, I'm going from selling a product to selling the author's voice. And, how do we best do that with authority? We do it with examples. We do it showing, using statistics and their data and their research. So it was almost, two sides of the same coin, all within the editorial wheelhouse with very different end goals, but similar processes in terms of how you might edit content.
That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Who's next? Who would like to ask a question?
Yes, I have a question.
Thank you, Remy. Go ahead.
Emma, my question is I know with you talked about AI being in something you guys have to work with right now. With AI
Mhm.
being a part of a lot of writers, I guess their tool bag now, as far as writing, how do you make sure your stories still feel and your information is still accurate and is actually yours in your words and not just something that's just generated by a machine?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I think it's one of the biggest issues that we're facing right now as an industry as a whole. Because right now, website traffic across every single publication is down because when you have a question, you can simply go to your search engine, look it up, and the AI summary comes up, and you got your answer. And then you don't have to go and read a bunch of articles to find what you're looking for. So we're seeing site traffic plummet across Forbes, across all of our competitors, every single one. And what we're finding is that although people are using AI to find these answers, at the same time, there's also a trust lapse where they don't necessarily trust AI to give them the most accurate information. And so that's where, as as publishing professionals, we come in and we really try and earn the trust of the reader so that they come back for more stories. And we have what we call now a high value reader, and that is someone who reads an article from us, likes it, and then decides to, follow us, subscribe, engage, comes back and trusts us to give them accurate news. And we do that by delivering content that sounds human. When you read your articles out loud, when you read your headlines, you can kind of say to yourself, does this sound like a human being wrote it? Like, is this something a human would say, or is this something that a robot would generate? And it becomes kind of easy to think, you know what, this doesn't really sound natural. So that is where we try and refine it and make it sound conversational. So at Forbes, if say we get like 10,000 views on an article, but 9,000 of those people read one article and leave and never come back. Those 1,000 views of people who return are far more valuable to us than the 9,000 who bounce and don't come back. So then it's about how do we get that 1,000 return viewers to come back again. And that's when we just figure out what they're looking for in their content. We do our audience research and we think, what they're looking for authority. They're looking for um, an approachable, accessible voice. How do we give them what they want so that they come back for more? I would say a lot of, we're learning to work with AI. That is kind of the only option at this point because if we fight it, we fall behind. So we have to find ways to integrate it in a way where it's not in control, where we're still in control, but we're almost using it, as you said, Remy, as a tool. So a lot of times, what we might do is we use it as a co-thinker, as a brainstorming partner. So say you have an idea for a story and you don't necessarily, and you've outlined it and you've created talking points and you kind of know what you want to say, but maybe there's a local spin that you can't quite find. I'll sometimes brainstorm with AI and say, you know what, like here's what I have. What do you think about, the development of this for this audience? Or what am I missing? What's another source that do you have any ideas for subject matter experts that I could interview to make this piece stronger? And sometimes, AI will suggest, well, why don't you talk to a policy analyst? Like, and they can speak to housing costs and so and so on. I think that's a really good idea. And then I go and I find that policy analyst myself. But it does offer some suggestions. And I think what some of our writers do is they will plug in, say they have a heading that they really like. They might plug that into AI and say, here's this heading for an article that I want to use. Like, do you think this is forward facing? Is this compelling? What are some alternatives? What might be more accessible for search, that sort of thing? And it gives them a couple of other alternatives they might work with. And it's not an end all be all solution, but I do kind of think of it as my intern, like things that don't necessarily want to spend the time doing, but can benefit from some help. So we're still, every day is different. We're refining it, we're working with it, but there are absolutely pieces that you see online that you read and you think this was not written by a human. This just wasn't. It doesn't sound like how humans speak. And that makes you not want to go back and read the publication again because you're like, humans aren't writing this content. How do I trust that it's accurate? So we're really, really careful about, how we phrase things, making things sound more conversational than ever.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you so much, Emma.
Yeah.
It's interesting because when I used to use AI a little bit more to help me like write emails and the way I communicate with
Mm-hmm.
someone. And then I got tired of it always putting way too many M dashes and always saying at the end best regards. So I was like,
Best regards.
I'm
It
like,
does love best
it
regards.
does best regards. I'm
It
like,
does.
oh goodness. So I
Yeah.
guess that there are some key like it just repeats itself on the same things.
Yeah, it does. There's a lot of phrases that you'll see come up again and again, and
Yeah.
that kind of tells you, oh, this is a
Yeah.
red flag.
Yeah.
And I think there are AI detection tools out there. I wouldn't say they're the best, they're not the most reliable because, half the time they'll tell you something's generated by AI when you've written it yourself and it's not. Other times it doesn't count. You know, it was just not reliable yet. So we just don't have a great way to definitively say this was written by AI. We kind of looked for context clues and the way things are structured, but it's very tough. It is. But all we can really do is adapt and try to find ways to think of it as a coworker
Mhm.
in a weird way.
Yeah, I agree. Um, what other questions do you all have? I haven't heard from Gio, Josh, Jordan, Derek. What questions do you have?
Um, my question would probably be towards so I'm going to NYU
Oh, wow.
after Morehouse to pursue journalism. I wanted to ask, like, what are some steps that I should be taking, even post grad, or even during grad school, to write for a major publication like Forbes?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, New York is one of the best places to be for journalism, because there are so many publications headquartered there. And I would say, as you're in grad school, never underestimate the value of a good internship or fellowship. And, all of these publications, they've got internships, fellowship positions that are open. Always try and do that. On-campus publications are a really good way to get started. Anything that you can add onto your resume. You can always proactively pitch um, any publication on a story that you're interested in writing on. I mean, a lot of places take contributed content. Sending in, for example, the New York Times has an opinion section, The Guardian and Washington Post. You can draft a pitch and submit for consideration. Anything that you can add to your portfolio will bolster your voice. I would recommend definitely making a website, collecting any published clips. If you have a blog or anything personal, definitely share that on your website, just sort of building that portfolio to share. Because when you start applying for jobs, one of the things they often ask is, do you have any published clips? Do you have any writing samples? We want to learn about your voice. So having something in your pocket to then say, oh yeah, here's my website, here's my portfolio with everything I've done, and you can include school projects, you can include anything, that you've kind of done in your free time, whether it's creative or investigative, just to give potential employers an idea of what your voice sounds like when you write or your editing style. But definitely there are, writers guilds you can join, editors guilds you can join, working groups, a lot of LinkedIn groups where people kind of network. There are networking events. Those are fantastic, where you can hand out your resume or just swap emails. I think there's something to be said for proactive LinkedIn pitching when if you see a role that's open or what have you, kind of, reaching out to people on LinkedIn. Some people are receptive, some people aren't, but just to sort of say, hey, or would you be open in talking to me about your experience at this publication? I noticed a role is open here. I was thinking about applying, that sort of thing. A lot of recruiters and HR professionals are very open about talking about openings at their organizations. So you can also find those on LinkedIn. But I think it's more, the more proactive you are, the more you can get out of it. But definitely, highly, highly recommend the internship fellowship route if possible. It's not always the most lucrative because you get either no pay or like a very minimal stipend. And it's just sort of this like unfortunate reality that we live in, especially in publishing. But it is the best way to get your foot in the door.
Absolutely, thank you. I do have one more question for you.
Yeah.
What is your editing style?
Ooh, good question. I think I try to stay. So I think it's interesting because I'd say as a person, I have a very like almost comedic, humorous sense like of writing. And I put jokes in my writing. I write with examples like self-deprecating humor. Obviously, that doesn't always translate or usually translate at all when you're editing someone else's pieces. So what I try and do is really step into this person's role. And first, I read the piece front top to bottom, read the piece top to bottom, try and get into their mindset. I kind of learn a little bit about the writer's background and say, okay, this person is coming from academia. They're going to have a rather institutional tone. If we need to be writing for a Forbes audience of people who aren't necessarily academics, who are just everyday people, how do we tone this down a bit to make it more approachable to everyone? And that's when I start line by line pulling words that maybe are a little bit too pretentious, or, this is not the most commonly used form of this word. What can we swap? How can we structure this so that it doesn't have as much heavy data in the forefront and make it more approachable as soon as you start reading it? And I try and do this with a sense of I am your friend, I am your coach. We are doing this together. We are in this together. I am not editing to remove your voice or your knowledge or your experience. I am editing to make it stronger and to make it land with the audience we want it to land with. So much of it is about knowing your audience and who your readers are. Like 90% of it, that is going to inform how you edit. Because if you are publishing, for example, when I was at HBR with Nicole, our readers or their readers are academic, are professionals who have a lot of experience in certain fields and will comprehend higher level studies and frameworks and thought leadership. Whereas Forbes is more people who might have minimal to no financial literacy at all. So you're going to be editing for a very different reader than you would be at HBR. These are people who might not necessarily have college degrees, who are coming to the website just to find the most fundamental information of how do I start a savings? How do I start saving? How do I do it? So it's going to be very different. You have to keep that in mind. Um, so yeah, I just kind of incorporate all of these things when I'm in editing, and over time you start to develop your own process that works for you. But of course, it's going to require different things depending on your audience and the publication you end up at. I mean, if you're, I know, I heard a lot of people are interested in sports journalism, and that's going to be a whole different beast, right? Because sports readers are coming for something very different than finance readers for the most part. A lot of sports readers are sports fans, understand the fundamentals of how a sporting event operates. So they might not need a play-by-play of the like how, what it means to like kick a field goal. They know. They don't need you to explain like, the starting lineup on the Eagles. They know. You can launch right into what's going on and they have this fundamental understanding already there. So those are things to keep in mind.
Excellent. It's interesting when you say that it's fundamental that you know who your audience is. How did you learn the audience at Forbes or
Yeah.
HBR or anything that you've edited,
I
really?
mean, I think a lot of it is, I mean, there are a couple of ways, right? We have our internal analytics teams who do a lot of research, and they are the ones conducting surveys, focus groups, looking at site traffic, and they can kind of see from all that who your average readers are, how long they spend reading a page, if they click links, where they're geographically coming from. We can look at subscriber data, and at HBR they did a lot of research as to how old subscribers were, their median incomes, like what level of job roles they had. Were they executives? Were they mid-career? Were they early career, etc. And that kind of informs where they are in their lives. And then again, when you start working at a publication and you start talking to your fellow editors who have been there for a long time and have been editing and working with the content, you could kind of see based on how the content is written and structured, like, okay, this is who they're targeting because it's not super technical, it's very friendly, it's very accessible. I myself might not be a finance guru, but I can understand what they're talking about in this article because it's written for someone who doesn't have a ton of experience. If you are from that walk of life where you say, I don't understand anything about investing, But I read an article from Forbes and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I get it. I get the fundamentals. It's probably written for a beginner audience. Um, I think the interesting thing about it is that whether you're writing for novices or whether you're writing for experts, the way that you structure your articles is going to be very similar with subheadings, bullet points, takeaways, conclusions, your strong lead in that graph, because an expert is going to be coming to a piece for a specific answer to a specific question, whereas a novice is going to be coming just for a basic understanding. But you can often find both in the same piece, depending on the scannability.
Excellent. All right. So I want to hear from some other folks. This is great insight. Looking at who hasn't chatted. Derek, I'd love to hear from you.
Had a question.
Oh, and Josh, go ahead.
I
And then
think
Yeah, I do
hold
have
on,
one question.
hold on 1 second. So why don't we start with Josh and then we'll go to Derek.
I was gonna say going off the audience question, is there any time a publication or that you've worked for has like changed audience? And if there has, how do you like adapt to maybe if there's like a change in audience or
Yeah, I
because of
mean,
different things? Yeah.
Nikki, this happened. This happened at HBR, like,
Yeah.
right in the middle of the year.
Yeah.
HBR started targeting the senior executive, which, people with a lot of work experience who had the means to subscribe. And this was sort of an effort to combat AI and falling website traffic, realizing that those who subscribe to the magazine were more senior people. So we were doing kind of a young professionals avenue, and that wasn't really seeing a payoff. And so pivoted to a senior executive. And that kind of totally changes the direction you're going in, right? All of a sudden, you're not writing content for those who are early in their career. You're doing quite the opposite. And so having to transition and having your writers transition to that voice it's tough, but you kind of it's an experimental and you kind of know through you can see based on the interactions or how well your content is performing whether or not you're hitting that audience. And you kind of remember, okay, these are experts, these are senior experts. You don't have to explain any fundamentals to them. Like they know what it means right out of the gate. Like they're interested in the new theories, thoughts, frameworks, anything actionable. They want that strategy, the stuff that they can implement on their teams immediately. They are ready to go. And so you keep that in mind as you're editing. They don't need hand-holding. You just go. You go full throttle. And yeah, that totally dictates the way your content's written and how you edit it and even the pitches that you accept because all of a sudden you're analyzing each pitch thinking, is this something that this new audience is going to relate to or not? Because if it's not, we probably can't proceed with it.
That's very fair. And talk about a shift. So to expand on what Emma was saying, before at HBR, we had sub brands
Mhm.
that, for example, reached out to women, the
Mm,
women aspect of our audience, like the section of our audience, or emerging talent, right? And then so all those got deprioritized or even folded to focus on okay, we're going to go after a very senior leadership audience, which ultimately, even from a revenue standpoint, they figure might have decision-making power to buy said subscription or experiences with HBR. So those business decisions are made
yeah.
that impact what kind of audience. All right, Derek, you were busting at the seams to ask Emma a question. I'm sorry I interrupted. What was your question?
Yeah, my question, I feel like, because what I've retained, like, from this class, especially, I feel like with my writing, like, 'cause I write about sports a lot, it's like, try not to be, like, repetitive. And I would ask you, like, as an editor, especially for, like, a higher publication, like, for Forbes, what are, like, some of the things that you do to, like, not be repetitive in your writing and make sure, like, your writing is more, like, complex and, like,
Yeah.
stands out and things of that, like that?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's a good one. And especially I think for sports specifically, it can become easy to sound repetitive, right? If you're doing play by plays, that sort of thing. I mean, after a while, if you read enough pieces, you kind of start to see a formula emerge. And so to keep it fresh, I think one of the best ways to think about it is, what current events can I tie into this sporting event? And what are the greater implications outside of just the game itself? There was, we have a sports money editor, and she was working on what she was doing March Madness. And so, every year it kind of follows the same structure. But this year she was looking at the union. I'm trying to remember what it was because I'm not the sports editor, so excuse me if I botch this. But the women's WNBA was unionizing, and the WNBA did unionize, which affected player take home pay. And so she was folding that into the wider story of March Madness and um, all of the playoff game and how this affected women's sports in the wider scheme of things. And so there are ways, basically, what I'm saying is that you take current events and you can tie them into game play by plays or what's going on in the industry as a whole. And that will kind of keep it fresh, especially when you're covering events that happen annually. People want to know who's in the Final Four, but they also want to know, well, here tie in sports betting. What does that mean? Sports betting and prediction markets are huge right now, right? A fresh way a fresh story, a fresh take would be, here's the Final Four. What does this mean for your predictions and your sports betting predictions, that sort of thing. So there are all these, it's important to stay up on the games and the players and the team dynamics, but it's also important to stay fresh on what's happening in the industry surrounding sports in terms of money, in terms of politics, in terms of geographies and everything shifting because they all ultimately trickle down and affect the players and the game.
I couldn't have said that better
Thank you.
myself. Yeah. That was a great question, Derek. Thank you. I'll just comment on that. I think that's a great way to look at it because sports much like music or so it speaks more to just that one instance or that one event or that one moment. And I was thinking when you were talking, I was thinking about the Chicago Bears possibly going to Indiana. There's like so many stories in there. It's like how did the city of Chicago possibly even be in a situation where they could lose it to Indiana? So
Yeah.
I feel like that's almost like a local politics story,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
or even like what would that mean from an economic standpoint for the city of Chicago, and then also for I'm assuming it says Indiana. I don't know if it's Indianapolis, but even what would that mean? So yeah, I find that so interesting, and there are many stories, whether it's a hard news story, a economics, finance story, a feature story, a political story. I feel like sports, there's so many opportunities for you all to really dive into what sports could mean, like the editorial and the narratives that you write and capture. I see Jordan said, "I got you." I'm assuming that means you have a question. Jordan, what's your question?
What's a mistake you see young writers make that instantly kind of hurts their credibility?
Okay, let's see. I think it's hard, and I try not to stereotype because I've been in the position where I've been a young writer trying to prove myself. But there have been times where trying to prove yourself might come off as arrogance, right? When you kind of step in and say, "Well, here's a story that I want to write. I have the expertise to cover it. I have, the ability, I have the interview skills, what have you." And sometimes it can be misconstrued as, "Oh, this is like, you don't have the experience to take this on." And I think humility goes a long way to say, saying, "I have an idea. I welcome your feedback. I would like your feedback, but here's what I'm thinking. Would this be of interest to to your audience? Because I've read some of your content and, I noticed that your themes are X, Y, and Z. And maybe because of that, this would be of interest to you. Here's my plan of action if I were to cover it. So go in almost like a request, like, can I cover this for you? It would be my honor to cover this for you. But don't go in and say, I have a story that is going to break you guys open and, change the landscape of publishing because, some journalists have been doing this for decades and, it doesn't happen often that a story breaks a publication open or what have you. But humility goes a long way. Everyone is also very, very bogged down. Everyone has a ton on their plate. So if you're sending a pitch, make it as concise as you can. Get their attention within the first like line or two and kind of get to the premise. Like don't send I get like 6 page long pitches for articles. I just don't have time to read it. Actually, that's one of the ways that AI has kind of worked into my work stream because sometimes I'll plug the pitch in and say, what does this say? I don't have time to read this whole thing. What is the crux of it? So be bullet points, and be concise and be polite. And that's kind of it. Also be open to learning. I think mentorship opportunities are really important and kind of reaching out and say, I am interested in learning from you. Like are you willing to impart, any experience? Like what can you teach me? Um, is a great way. But yeah, that's probably what I would say.
Yeah, I love that. A lot, Emma, I talk about, thank you for the question. A lot I talk about is to actually maybe you can keep me honest, Remy, but I think maybe I talk about it more in my other class than this one, but I say thinking questions and not answers. And I think if you to Emma's point, if you're thinking in questions and with curiosity leading first, the humility will follow,
Yes.
versus just having an answer, which usually
Yes.
there's lack of humility in that.
That's so true. It's coming out and saying, I know that X, Y, and Z is happening because of X, Y, and Z is not always, it's not the best approach because this might not be true if you haven't interviewed sources yet, if you don't have the data to back it up.
Mhm. Very good. So Tyler Speed, the other Tyler, said you have a question. What's your question?
Yeah, I want to ask, how has your writing changed over throughout your career?
It's a good question. I would say I've become more comfortable with it. When I first started, and I was a bit insecure about, is this good? Is this right? Is this
Mm,
what people want to read? Am I getting the right information out there? As I do it more and I work with more people and I learn about my audiences and my readers, I kind of just feel more comfortable that my voice is hitting or that they accept what I have to say or how I edit. A lot of it is, imposter syndrome when you first start and you're kind of like, why am I here in this newsroom with all of these like very impressive people and I'm right out of college and I don't know what I'm doing. But as you start to, get that experience, you build that confidence, you start establishing relationships. I think the process just comes a lot easier. It's almost like learning a language. I think
mm,
when I started learning Spanish and I started trying to speak Spanish to native Spanish speakers, it was like the most embarrassing thing I have ever done in my life. And they would look at me like, what? And I'm like, I'm so sorry. I am trying my hardest. Um, and Duolingo didn't really help, I'll be honest. But like as I got a little bit more fluent, a little bit more conversational, you start to feel less embarrassed. You start to feel better about, speaking that language to native speakers. And so it's very similar. I think the more
mm.
you do it, the more comfortable you become, and your writing style just flows more naturally.
Great question. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. What other questions do you have? We have a little less than 6 minutes. So did anyone have a final one? This is a room full of journalists. You all should be having a lot of questions. Okay.
Has
Yes, I have a
anyone
question.
had? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Um, Going back to working with so many people in different settings, especially working with your clients and wanting to give them the best details you can give them when you do your, especially with finance and everything.
Hmm.
As the financial landscape always jumps and changes from day to day, especially now, day to day, how do you secure those, going back to your point of securing those consistent readers who say, hey, I know I can go to Emma and what she's going to give me is going to calm my insecurities or keep
Hmm.
me a little relaxed compared to the news and what I'm seeing?
I think a lot of it is staying on, you have to read the news in order to write the news. You need to know what's going on day to day in the industry. And that's a huge ask, right? Because there's a million things going on in finance every single day. And as you said, it's changing constantly. But every morning I get up and I have my news aggregate and I read the stories from Yahoo Finance, I read Investopedia, I read some of the top line stories from Wall Street Journal just to get acquainted with what's happening. And that sort of helps with this constant shift because, if you don't know what's happening, you can't write about it, you can't edit on it, you can't fact check it. So, as important as it is to work with your writers and edit, you also have to be a news consumer, like a massive news consumer. So this job, I mean, it's twofold, right? It's editing and it's writing, but it's also a lot of reading. And it's a lot of reading stories and thinking, this is an interesting take, but they didn't answer this question. And that's an opportunity for us to step in and say, here's this, here's an answer to a question this other article didn't address. And it also you start to think about different angles. Like, oh, you know what? This is written for investors, but I wonder what like students might think about the same topic because they're going to approach it in a totally different way than institutional investors might. And that's where you sort of write for a different audience. I mean, you have different plot points and you have different information in there and you interview different people and different experts. So I think you learn a lot just from reading one news story. You can then develop like 10 other news stories that are related but different.
That's
Thank you
true.
so much.
Thank you. Great question, Remy. I feel like to your point, a lot of articles just yield more questions when you get done with it. You
Right,
wish the reporter had addressed
right.
something. You still you have another, or you want to know more, or
Where you think, what does this mean for me? Like,
yeah,
I understand this is happening, but what does that mean for
yeah,
me? How does it affect me?
exactly.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
enter Remy as a reporter who's going to answer
Hmm.
that. So we're 12:57. I think that's all the time we have for questions. Emma, excellent job. I really
Thank
appreciate
you. Thank you. Thank you
it.
all so much for having me. Please, if I'm on LinkedIn, if you guys have any more questions, please feel free to reach out. Nikki, if you want to share my email, totally fine. But I wish you all luck in your journeys to journalism. It's a fun field. It's changing fast, but it's really exciting.
Yeah, it is. Hold on for the ride.
Yeah. Yes, you're in for it.
Yes, and I will definitely in Slack you all will share Emma's Forbes email.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, absolutely. So learn to expand your network and
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
All right. So I'll let you all go. Please read my Slack message that I wonderfully crafted for your edification so that you can keep organized and know where we're at. And then I'll probably write one more note for you. Oh goodness. Um, I'll write one more note for you probably this weekend just to keep you organized. And thank you for your time, Emma. Bye, everyone.
Sure.
Bye.